Hello, everyone. So first off, I'd like to thank VAFA and especially Abby for inviting me to talk about our work. So my name is Thomas Eady, and I'm a postdoc researcher at the UPenn Swine Research Center, where we've been doing a lot of work on gilt welfare and especially confinement with my PI Tom Parsons. So for a little bit of background, pigs are somewhat recent for me. I joined the swine unit in 2022, but I used to work with dairy cattle in Canada before that. And actually, Nina von Kaiserlink, who's also on the program for today, was one of my PhD supervisors. So it's great to meet again this way. For the agenda, I'll give a quick background on crates and welfare with a focus on the US. Then I'll go into more details on two studies on gestation stall that we've recently done at Swine Unit. So the first study is on preference, so comparing choices for a crate versus an open area. And the second is a study on motivation, where we looked at how much gilts try to escape a crate when they were confined to it. So finally, we're going to be talking a little bit about how we plan to expand on those results and where we think the next areas of study are likely to be. So for a very, very quick background on pig production, really a major evolution of pig farming for almost 100 years at this point has been really the collapse in the number of pig farms. So you can see on the top graph here that in the 1950s it was around several millions of farms in the US, and at the latest census, so in the 2020s, it was around 60,000. So now this is not because there is less interest in pork products, because when you look at the pig production, so with the bottom graph, there's been a steady increase over the same time period. So there are kind of many factors to explain this, especially the post-World War II incentives to produce a lot of food, and also at the same time some massive advances in technology. But the point is that we end up with a low number of farms and a high production. So of course this means that we have a higher number of pig per farm, with a lot of the time thousands of animals per operation. The point here is that over the last century, agriculture as a whole has shifted more towards an intensive system that is very much about efficiency. And part of this efficiency is to reduce the amount of space that is being used per animal, which is how we kind of arrive to systems that you see on the picture here, where you have a very high number of animals that are being kept in pretty tight, small spaces. So now when you put a lot of animals, especially hierarchical animals like pigs, in small spaces, you're going to run into some problems pretty quick. So if you put all of them together, a major problem that is going to happen is that they're going to fight, especially for things that they value, like access for feed. So you might also get some very challenging situation where you have some animals that initially struggle when they're fighting because they might be subordinate, so they can't really access the feed because they can't fight that well, meaning that they're going to struggle to put on weight, meaning that they're going to struggle even more during the future fights. So you can get into this kind of vicious circle for some of those animals that really is going to make it challenging for them to get better. So now one approach that's been done to let's say fix this problem is with crates, where you have animals that are confined individually, so they can be fed individually, so you don't have this problem with feeding, and the animals also have no way to really physically harm each other. So as a quick reminder on the sow cycle, it is divided in two main phases. So you have gestation and lactation. So for gestation, it is the rule of threes. So it lasts for 3 months, 3 weeks, and 3 days. So around 115 days total. And after farrowing, the piglets and the sows are usually kept together for around 3 weeks. Then the piglets are weaned and the cycle starts again for the sow. Of course, there is variation depending on the kind of system you're looking at, but that's a fairly standard practice. And when we're talking about confinement in crates, it can be either during gestation or farrowing. So those are associated with similar welfare concerns for the sow. But for this presentation, we're going to be focusing more on gestation stalls for a couple of reasons. First, the gestation period is longer than the lactation or the nursing one, so really it affects a bigger part of the sow cycle. Second, the confinement during gestation is in a way a more straightforward problem than during lactation, because during gestation you don't really need to worry about the sow laying on her piglets yet. So for the gestation crate, the standard size is around 7 feet by 2 feet, so around 2 meters by half a meter, and so it is barely bigger than the animal. So it's obviously very restrictive for them. The range of motion is pretty much getting up, lying down, and maybe taking one step forward and one step back. But very basic behavior like turning around or actual movement or full social contact is really not possible in this kind of system. Another part of kind of standard practice with stalls is that there is going to be no bedding that's provided. So it's usually on concrete, which is very barren and can be very abrasive to the animals. Now, the industry is moving away a little bit from this practice, especially in Europe, and also in some ways in the US, but according to the most recent census I could find, it is still the most common way to house the gestation sows in the US. Another point that is, I think, important to note is that in many cases where it might not be considered an actually like crate system, they are still being created for a temporary amount of time, and this kind of temporary amount of time really depends on the legislation of the country. So the fact that they are so restrictive to the animals has led to a lot of welfare concern over crates, and there is actually a pretty consistent rejection of this kind of system from the public. Now you could say it's because the public doesn't really know what they're talking about, but actually when the public get more information about the crates, they reject it even more. So it is clear that that rejection is not because they're misinformed. It is also pretty consistent across countries. So it's more than 80% rejection for North America and Brazil, and you can find really similar sentiment in the EU with the End the Cage Age initiative that was brought up to the European Commission a few years ago. So yeah, I think the overall public opinion on gestation crate is pretty clear, is that the public opposes them. Now, this public rejection has led to some policy changes. So here, this is not a full list, but the point is that there is legislation in multiple countries. Important to note is that, like I brought it up before, in most cases, it's not a total ban. It still allows some temporary crating, that sometimes it can go from just the time needed to do a simple procedure, and in other cases it can go up to several weeks. So in the US there is this extra layer to legislation because different states can have different laws, and some states have limited the use of stalls for their own production, but it didn't have a huge impact because those states weren't the big pork producers of the country. Now there is 2 states, so California and Massachusetts, that have introduced some legislation, so Prop 12 for California and Question 3 for Massachusetts. And those laws, they not only restrict their own production, but they also put restriction on imported products. So this has had a way bigger impact, especially because California is such a huge market because they have such a big population. So a lot of states export to California, so there has been a fair amount of pushback from the industry on Prop 12, and it went all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court, and they upheld it. But there is new legislation that's being introduced that's trying to kind of cancel the effect of Prop 12. So I'm recording this in July, so I'm not really clear on where it's going to be at in October. Outside of this policy aspect, there's also a number of certification programs that allow producers or retailers to market their pork that have better welfare practice. Although the number of those programs can sometimes make it confusing, and also sometimes the language in those certification can be a little bit unclear, especially when it comes to the temporary crating. So there are also companies and actually some pretty big players when it comes to restaurant chains and retailers that have committed or already met the goal to not use pork that was raised in gestation stalls. Once again, there is some wiggle room on temporary crating, but it does show that there is a shift in where those companies perceive their consumers' expectations to be. Now, those are just a few examples of the bigger brands, but there are a lot of other brands that have committed to be gestation stall free. So a common alternative to individual stalls is group housing. But group housing is actually a pretty vague term, and there are a lot of different ways to set it up. So here I've put some examples of what comes up when you Google, group housing for pig. And so you can have, some different kind of space allowance, different group size, pen setup, different kind of flooring or enrichment and all these kind of things. So the point of this presentation is not really to get into too more details on group housing. And there's actually a presentation from Jeremy Marchand for VAFAW that was a couple of webinars ago. So I do recommend you check that out if you're interested in more details. So yeah, for this presentation, we're going to be focusing more on, let's say, the more basic part on confinement, right? Since gestation crates are still very common, it is about addressing this confinement from the animals. So the comparison between crates and group housing is going to be with the bare minimum. So something that's more like the bottom right corner where you have a system that's very simple, where space is still very restricted and the environment is still pretty barren. So far, I have talked about a lot of different stakeholders. So between the public opinion, the policy, the retailers, but really we haven't really focused yet on animals, even though they are really at the heart of the problem. So when we do focus on those animals, what does the literature tell us? And there is a lot of literature actually looking at the crates. Thankfully, I won't have to detail everything because there are 2 meta-analyses that went over around 50 studies. So that does make my life a little easier. So in 2004, there was a first review of around 35 studies, and in 2013 they added around 17. So the overall conclusion of those two reviews is that when we're looking at what we consider to be the more usual welfare indicators like performance, stereotypies, or stress responses like cortisol or heart rates, there isn't an obvious difference between animals in crates and animals that are kept in a group. Now, of course, there is some differences when you're looking at individual studies, but when you're trying to get this kind of bird's eye view, you don't really see an overall clear effect between crates and stalls. So what does that mean for the welfare of the animals, right? Does that mean that the public, which has a very negative view of the stalls, is wrong, that we don't really need to worry too much about the welfare of those animals because it doesn't seem to be too much of a difference between stalls and crate, or is there something else? So the things with measures like productivity or performance or stress measures is that we're really talking about only one aspect of welfare, which is health or physiological markers, and those can be sometimes pretty limited in their sensitivity, right? If you have an animal that has really bad health, well, it's a good indicator that their welfare is bad. But having an animal that is, that seems healthy, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're having a good welfare. So there are several frameworks of animal welfare. Here I've just put a couple examples with the 3 circles from Fraser and the 5 domains from Meller. And between those frameworks, you see that there is one component of welfare that is kind of consistently here, and it's this notion of affective states or mental states, which really deals with the animal's perspective about the way they're feeling. So it might be called differently depending on the framework you're looking at, but it is usually going to be there, this aspect of it. And unfortunately, when it comes to pig confinement, this notion of affective state has been underlooked. So here I've put 2 quotes from a recent review on pig confinement, and they tell us that this aspect of affective state is missing from the literature. So in both of those reviews, they mention either the psychological or the emotional aspect that is missing from studies on confinement. So it is it's been underlooked because it is not necessarily a straightforward thing to do to get an animal's perspective about something. So just for a little bit more background on emotions or affective states, it is obviously a very complex field, and even in humans, it can be very complicated to assess emotions. But in humans, at least, the gold standard is with self-reports or verbal reports. So just asking directly to someone how happy they are, or how much pain they're in, or how much they like or they dislike something. Now, obviously, it's not something that we can do directly with animals, and one way to kind of make it easier for us is to simplify the framework. So we go from something like what you see here with the feeling wheels, where you have many options and a lot of kind of different components that are possible here, to a space with only two axes. So you got the horizontal axe that is valence, so whether something is positive or negative, and the vertical axe that is arousal, so meaning the level of activation of an emotional state. So for example, depression is going to be an emotional state with a negative valence and a low arousal, whereas if you look at something like joy or happiness, is going to be something with a positive valence and a high arousal. So anyway, for our purpose, we're actually going to simplify this framework even more and only focus on valence. So really trying to get to the animal's perspective of how much they like or they dislike something. And yeah, one very common way to try and tap into that subjective perspective is through preference test. So by giving animals different options and seeing which one they choose, or how much time they spend with each option, it gives us an idea of at least the relative value of things like a resource or an experience. So for example, you can use preference test to see which enrichment might be more interesting for an animal, where you present different objects and you look at what kind of leads to the most engagement from them. Now, preference does have some weaknesses, and one of those main weaknesses is that it gives you an idea of the relative value. So, for example, option A over option B. But it doesn't really tell you whether both options are good or bad. And one way to fix this issue on relative value is to complement test of preference with test of motivation. And the main difference between preference and motivation is that motivation usually includes some kind of effort. So it's not a free choice. The animals have to either work to access something or to avoid it, which can give us a lot of information on whether something is experienced as being positive or negative by those animals. So yeah, a classic example of this would be lever presses for rodents. There's also been a lot of applications in farm animals. So with hens doing things like key pecking, push gates in dairy cows, and there's also been some application in pigs where they do panel pressing to access things like food. So the plan here is really to apply both preference and motivation test to study the confinement in the pigs. Now, on top of this notion of effective states, there's this other aspect of welfare that has been underlooked in the past, but that has gained some more attention recently, is this notion of individuality. So historically and still now, animal science does rely a lot on measures like a mean and standard deviation. The problem is that it implies this idea of kind of one ultimate representative individual, and with the rest of the population kind of spreading around it. So we do this because it's practical. It makes comparisons easier, but it does lead to a couple problems. The first is that we do lose a lot of information about our population, and the second is that the mean and standard deviation really make sense in the case of a population that has a normal distribution, which a lot of the time is really not the case, depending on the kind of measures you're taking. So there has been a little bit of a shift away from that, and trying to embrace more the variation that we see in the data, and instead of just considering it as random noise, and more trying to understand what's behind it and what might be causing it. So this has led to interest for measures that are specific to individuals, like personality, temperament, or coping styles, and how they relate to the welfare of the animals. So pulling kind of all this together, it brings us to our objective, which was to kind of explore that effective component of welfare when it comes to gestation crates. So by using preference and motivation test, and also integrating this notion of individuality into our studies. So for our first trial on preference, the experimental design was very simple, right? So first off, we used animals that were naive to crates. We put trios of gilts in a pen where they had free access between an open area and crates, and they had the same resource inside and outside, which was ad lib, food, and water. So then we just let them be for 7 days, and we looked at where they chose to go. And for our analysis of preference, we compared what we were seeing from the gilts to what we could expect by chance. So really comparing the behavior to the relative area of the crate and the open space. So in our case, the open area was 71% of the total area of that experimental space. So for the part on individuality, we did some very standard personality test where we put animals in a novel environment and we exposed them to a novel object, and we looked at how they react based on different behaviors. Once we have coded all those different behaviors, we use principal component analysis, or PCA, to reduce those different behaviors into main dimensions or components, which then we define as being the personality traits of those animals. Then once we have this, we can make the link between those personality traits and the preference we're seeing in the test between the crate and the open area. So first, I'm going to start with the overall results for the preference. So this data is over the 7 days of the trial. And here, so we have a graph that shows the percentage of time that is spent outside of the crates for all of the gilts. And it is showing it in two different ways. So first, you have a regular histogram with the vertical bar, and you also have the cumulative distribution with the black steps. So there is a lot of information here, but the main point is that you have half of the gilts that are spending more than 95% of their time outside of the crates. So this is kind of that dashed line that you see on the cumulative graph with the black steps, where half of those animals, they are like half of them are spending more than 95% of their time outside the crates. So it's very clear that there is an overall preference for the open area. The second point is that even though you have this clear preference overall, there are still a lot of individual differences with some gilts that are spending around half of their time inside the crates. So yeah, now that we have this kind of general idea of the preference, we can start diving a little deeper into the data. So since the test was over 7 days, the first question is whether the gilts were fixed in their preference over time, and they weren't. So for the effect of experimental day, it's something that you can see on both of those graphs, with the time that was spent outside of the crates going down with the days. So by the end of the experiment, they're still spending most of their time outside of the crates, but not as much as during the first day. So maybe what's happening here is that the gilts get habituated to the crates. So as the days go by, they realize that they can go in and out. So they lose that kind of aversion that is associated with confinement. The second effect that we see is that the gilts are actually spending more time in the crates at night than during the day. So we're not really clear on why. Maybe it feels safer for them to be in a less open area at night, but it's pretty unclear right now for this difference between day and night. So here, just one last way to look at those results. So here with a little bit more details, with each point representing one gilt. And once again, we see the same results as before, with that preference for the outside of the crate that is decreasing with the experimental day, but it is still like staying pretty high. And also how that preference is lower during the nighttime. I think here what's more kind of useful to see really is that you have once again individual differences. So you have some gilts that really want nothing to do with the crates. So those are the blue dots that you see that kind of align vertically above the 100%. So they're spending all of their time outside of the crates. And you have some animals that are spending some time in the crates, so they don't seem to mind as much, and especially more towards the end of the trial. So for the results on individuality, we tried to see whether we could explain some of those differences we were seeing in the preference result with what we were finding with the personality test. So when we ran that PCA, we saw two main dimensions. There was one that was associated with a general low activity and a high latency to approach the object. So we named this one, this component, passivity. And the other component was linked to a lot of time that was spent interacting with the object and spending really little time lying or sitting. So we defined this one as engagement, so being engaged during that normal object test. So when we fed this into our model on preference, we saw that passivity didn't have an effect on the preference for the outside, but engagement did. And it might seem a little counterintuitive that actually the gilts that were the more engaged were spending more time inside the crate. So it can seem a little surprising, but it does make sense in a way that it requires some degree of boldness to interact with the crates, because it can be, in a way, a scary device for the animals at the beginning, because it is associated with confinement. So the take-home points for this first trial is that we do have an overall preference for the outside of the crate, but there are nuances to this. There is a lot of individual differences, with some gilts spending more than half of their time inside the crates. Why that is, it's still unclear, but it does seem that there is some influence of gilt's personality on those preference results. The second point is that the time that was spent in crates increases with time, which could point to some kind of habituation mechanism where if the crates allow the animals to freely move in and out of them, they do lose this aversiveness, and in a way they become part of the open space. For the limit of the study, first off, here we're dealing with a free system, so animals can go in and out of those crates, which is not really representative of what you're going to have on farms, right? In kind of real world application, most of the time animals can't get out of those crates. The second limit is that preference is relative. So the fact that gilts chose one option over the other doesn't actually tell us whether they like or dislike either options. So this does bring us to our second trial on motivation. And just like before, we used gilts who had no experience with crates, but this time they could not go out of the stall. So they were confined in those stalls for 1 hour. And with engineers from NextFab in Philadelphia, we designed and we built a device that would allow us to measure the amount of force that was applied on the crate when the gilts tried to back out from them. So essentially, it's a big magnet that is linked to a load cell, which is connected to the swinging part of the stall. So it records every half second the amount of force that is being produced. So every time a sow or a gilt tries to back out, then it records the force that's being applied. So we did this for 16 gilts, which gives us, a lot of data, because we have 60 minutes times 16, and we have a measurement every half second. So yeah, it does give us a lot of data, and you can see here, I show kind of the raw data for the 16 gilts, and they each have a different colors. Now there's, of course, like a lot of information, And I'll simplify it, but I think just from this, we can see some of the main points. I think first off, there is a lot of diversity in the kind of behavior profiles where they don't all match up in a similar shape. So there are differences to how the gilts react to the confinement. The second point is that we could have expected the profiles to kind of generally go down after a few minutes, maybe even tending to zero as they get used to the crates or they kind of give up trying to exit. But it doesn't seem to be the case, right? There's still a lot of force that's being applied even after the 45-minute mark. So they don't really appear to be giving up. And finally, so here we're dealing with raw data, so it hasn't been cleaned yet, but there is some very high peaks, right, with some gilts that push the equivalent of 200 to 300 pounds. So unfortunately here we're working in a barn environment, so it is hard to get some very clean data. We had a fair amount of noise from our sensor. So the first step was to clean the data we were getting. So here I've just put a 10-minute example for a single gilt, but we did apply this to all of the data we had. So the first step was to apply a low-pass filter to remove the noise, and it gave us this kind of blue graph here with a smoother shape. And then second step was to define what we considered to be a push from the gilt. So to do this, we used the local maximum. So when the force measurement was going, up and down, and also above a certain threshold, then we considered this to be a pushing event. The advantage with this is that then we could extract properties of those pushing events, like the amount of force that was produced or the time at which the pushing event was happening. So here's kind of how it looks when you have the clean data for all the gilts over the 60 minutes. And I know that it's not really a readable graph, but it's kind of the point, because all of those red points, those red circles, are the pushing events from all of those gilts. So it really shows that all the gilts were pushing to try to get out of those stalls. So I have added some of the summary measures that we looked at, and this is really to reinforce that all of the gilts were showing some motivation, right? So you have the minimum number of pushes, that was 41, which is respectable over a 60-minute period. And the second point is that once again you have some individual differences. So staying with the number of pushes, you see that the maximum number of pushes is around 4 times the minimum. So it's quite a spread, and it's something that's very consistent across the different summary measures. So whether you're looking at the median force or the IQR, so the interquartile range, so that kind of looks at the variability of the amount of force that's being produced, you see this kind of variation between the gilts. So switching it up a little bit to try and visualize that spread between animals a little differently, here we're looking at the distribution of the force that the gilts were applying every time they were doing a pushing event. So every color represents a different gilt, but when we look at those distribution, it looks like there are really 2 kinds of profiles. Right, so you have the ones that are more on the left with kind of a high and a narrow shape, and then you have this other groups with a shape that is lower and a little more spread out. So to kind of look into this a little deeper, we ran a cluster analysis, and it did confirm what we thought was happening. So the gilts do split evenly between 2 clusters. So in one cluster, so the blue one, you do have some gilts that seem to do pushes with less force because their distribution is more towards the left, and they're also more consistent in the amount of force they're doing. So that's why the shape is more narrow. And in the other cluster, so the red one, you have animals that seem to be pushing with more force, so more towards the right of the graph, and they also have more variability. So you have kind of a wider distribution. So we did run some tests on different summary measures to compare the two clusters. And even though like all the gilts did show some level of motivation, there was one cluster that was more active in kind of their pushing attempts. So those are the red box plots. I won't go into details for all the measures, but the point here was that the gilts from this cluster, they were pushing harder, so they were producing more force, and also more often, so they were producing a higher number of pushes. I think another thing that's also very interesting is that there was actually no difference for the time of their first push and the time of their last push between the two clusters. So it means that regardless of the cluster, the gilts were very fast and eager in a way, and also persistent in the way they were pushing against the crate. So for the take-home points for the second trial, for the results, what we saw was that all gilts did show some level of motivation. But just like with the preference trial, we saw that there was also individual differences. And in the case of motivation, the gilts do appear to split into those two clusters, with one that's more active than the other. So it's still a little bit unclear on the detail, but it is consistent with a framework on coping styles that we have with piglets, where they can be classified as being either proactive or reactive, depending on how they react to a stressful situation. So that test is usually the back test, where I've put a picture here. But overall, I think one major limit with this notion of behavior profile is that the relationship between that profile and welfare is not very clear, right? We could imagine that the animals that are more active must be having the worst welfare because they're fighting the hardest. But I don't think it's that straightforward, right? It just might be a different way to cope with a similar negative situation for those animals. In the opposite way, you might even have some animals that are in such bad welfare that they give up any attempts to improve their situation. So something that's called learned helplessness, and that might be misinterpreted as just being not too active. So for the general summary between those two experiments, going back to our objective, which was to explore the gilt's effective state in relation to stalls, and also integrating this component of individuality into our studies, it does turn out we have converging evidence for both of these parts. So for the effective part, gilts overall, will spend most of their time outside of the crates when they have the choice, but when they don't have the choice and they're locked into a stall, they will show motivation to try and exit this crate. So when you take both of those evidence together, it really shows that crates are a negative experience for the gilts and really something they try to get away from. And so for the second point, in both trials, the response were not uniform, right? There were a lot of individual differences, either by being linked to personality or being grouped by behavior cluster. So it does really show that we need to take into account this notion of individual response when we're looking at animal welfare. So what's next? It's clear that gestation crates are negative for the animals, and they also have a very poor public image, and you also have policy and retailers that are moving away from it. But now the big question is, what should be the alternative. And if we want something that's sustainable, it needs to be something that works, for the animals, but for also the consumers, and also makes sense on farms. So so far, the legislation, at least in Prop 12, the focus has mainly been space allowance, but it does mean that group housing can still be very barren. So here you see the alternative that gilt had in our preference test. So that was the open area they could have access to. And I think it does make for a good indicator of how bad the crates were. If, they were so motivated to access this kind of space that was still fairly restricted and pretty barren. However, I'm not very convinced that this kind of open area is going to be enough when it comes to the public expectations on how we house animals. I think another big drawback is that if we're dealing with unfamiliar animals that are being, mixed very often on farms, aggression is going to be a big problem, especially if you put them in a barren environment, right? Because they won't have much else to do than fight because they have no distraction. So I think it is a good idea to explore what kind of system that goes beyond just space allowance and also integrates different components like the setup of the pen, the feed distribution system, the kind of flooring, and I think another big part is going to be the social dynamics. So now, there are so many different moving parts, figuring out how to kind of make it work, that transition from stall to group housing. It's probably not going to be just about a single factor, right? It's most likely going to be a combination of a lot of those different components. Finally, for just a slightly different point on what's next, so far when it comes to the public concern and the policy changes, the focus on confinement has been mostly on gestation crates, just because it's longer confinement and a more straightforward issue. But it is very likely that farrowing crates are going to be next in that public concern, right? It is a more complicated problem because you have the involvement of piglets, so you need to hit kind of that balance between the welfare of the sow and the welfare of the piglet. But it does seem that when the public learns about farrowing crate, they are still rejecting it. So here I've put some examples of surveys from different countries, and they all show that people do oppose farrowing crates even when they're informed of the benefits that they can have for piglets. So overall, I would say that it is very likely that the pushback that we've seen on gestation stall is probably going to be also applied to farrowing crates at some point in the future. So finally, I would like to thank everyone at our research farm, also my co-author for the papers I've talked about, Mia Ceribelli and Tom Parsons, and also the engineers from NextFab who really helped us in building that force measuring device. For the funding, the work was done thanks to the Mary Moore Research Fund, and also thank you to VAFAW and Abby especially for this invitation to talk about the work we're doing at the Swine unit. And thank you for your attention.